In this video, I want to show you 2 easy ways to crochet, even as a beginner or as a refresher, both with using a crochet hook or just even using your fingers. It will be super easy to follow. First step will be to make a slip knot. So I just fold the end of a yarn, make a crossover, pinch it, and then I'm going to put my fingers through the loop and I'm going to pull the working yarn up, and this creates the slip knot. So what I want to demonstrate is a simple chain of 10 stitches just for the video so you can follow along and see everything. For the extra large blanket, I chained 40 stitches and the blanket size was 5 feet by 5 feet. With a start chain, all you're doing is you're pulling the working yarn through each loop with your crochet hook. And again, I want to show a sample size for the video. So you're always going to count that you have the amount on the chain that you want. And again, for the sake of the video, I'm just showing you in 10, but for the blanket itself, I started with a chain of 40. So always really important to count how many stitches you've created before you start your first single crochet. The trick is the yarn that's on the actual crochet hook, so the loop that's on this hook right now is not part of the chain. So to create our first single crochet, use your loop, wrap your working yarn, and chain 1. Then we're going to go back to the 10th chain that we had. So I'm going to take the crochet hook. I had a loop on my hook. I added a stitch. Now I'm going back to the 10th stitch from the end. And this is creating your first single crochet. So you'll have 2 loops. Pull the working yarn through both loops. And that is our start single crochet. Our first single crochet. We're going to start our first row from the chain. I promise this will make sense. The trick is when you're working with really chunky yarn, you've got to make sure that your loops and all your stitches are really stretched out and big enough. You don't want your blanket to be too tight or it won't flow. So really important to make sure that your loops are big, even a little bit bigger than your crochet hook. So I'm going into what was the 9th loop, making a single crochet. And we're going to go over this a few times, so if you haven't picked everything up just yet, not to worry. So I just made my second single crochet from the end of my chain. So I'm using the top bump, going into that 8th stitch. Now I'm going to pull up my working yarn with the crochet hook. I'll have 2 loops on my crochet hook. Again, make sure your loops are big enough. Wrap your working yarn and pull it through 2. And that again is a single crochet with the chunky yarn. So all I'm doing is counting backwards when I started the chain. Now I'm going to keep going in through all the loops all the way down the chain, and I should have 10 single crochets. So again, you'll have a loop on your hook, pull into the chain your next stitch, you'll have 2 loops, pull the working yarn through both, and again make sure that your loop sizes are relatively big. When you get down to the last stitch, you're not going right in the knot, you're just going into that last stitch, pull the working yarn through, you have 2 loops, wrap your working yarn again, pull through 2. So what I want to do is I want to create my next single crochet. So the loop that was on my hook, I actually add a stitch before I flip my work over. So what's important is to count that you have 10 single crochets at this point. So what I'm doing is counting and making sure that I have 10 single crochets right across. The loop that I ended this row with and the extra loop that I made is going to apply into the second row. So I'm just counting 10 single crochets. So that loop and the extra loop is actually the next single crochet going into row 2. So I'm counting again 10 loops that I've made with single crochets across. The end one is always a little bit on the side there. So now that I have 10 single crochets, I had that loop, I added my stitch before going into my second row. So I'm going into that end stitch, and the single crochets, when you're looking at them from the top, it looks like a braid. So there's almost these two loops you're going to go into. So now that I've started my single crochet, I've made my first single crochet on the second row. When you're doing your single crochets on your second row, the stitches now actually have 2 bumps in them because of the first row you did. So again, make sure that your loops are nice and big, a little bit bigger than the crochet hook, and you're going to continue across this row doing single crochets. These single crochets, as I mentioned, now actually have 2 bumps that you're going into. So you'll notice those 2 loops, you're going in it as 1 stitch. Once you get to the end of your row, you're going to pick up that last stitch, but it's kind of off to the side a little bit. Not to worry, you're just going to pick that last one up. You're just building that architecture for the whole project. So we're picking up that single crochet. Again, it's just a little bit off to the side there. As a beginner, it's always hard not to think that you're doing something wrong at this point, but you're doing just fine. So you're going to pick up a loop with the 2 loops, pull the working yarn through both. So now I've done 10 single crochets. I have a loop left over and I've added a stitch. But the key here is what I have on my crochet hook right now, that's part of the single crochet going into the 3rd row. So I'm just recounting all my stitches, so I have 10 single crochets to go through. And this will help prevent any mistakes as you're learning. And this is why I wanted to do a sample size on the video, just to show you the foundation of how the whole blanket comes together. So remember, we had the ending loop, we added a stitch, and this is part of our next row of single crochets. So I'm starting my 3rd row of single crochets. Now I'm getting to that last stitch. So I'll find those 2 bumps from the previous double crochet from the row 2, just sticking my finger through that. And that is actually going to help keep the blanket nice and straight. I have a loop, I picked up one with the working yarn, and I pulled the working yarn through both. So the key here is I have a loop, I'm adding a stitch, then I'm going to flip my work around, but what I have on that crochet hook right now is the next portion of that single crochet. Sometimes that's the most confusing part about learning to crochet, is knowing that you had a loop, you add a stitch at the end of each row, and that's actually part of the whole architecture of your first single crochet going into the next row, and so on. So I'm going to finish my 3rd row. To complete my 3rd row of single crochets, I'm going to pick up that last single crochet. Once you finish the last single crochet, you're going to have that 1 remaining loop on your crochet hook. So let's go through some of this just using our hands instead of a crochet hook. So we'll go through those steps really quickly and see if it helps simplify by just using your hands instead of the crochet hook. So we made the slip knot. Now I'm going to pull the working yarn and I'm going to make a chain of 10. And again, this is just to keep everything on the camera so you can see. Once I've made my 10 loops on my chain, I'm going to count, making sure I have 10 loops on my chain. The loop that's in my hand only counts as a single crochet. It does not count as part of my row of 10. So to start my first chain of single crochets, I'm going to add a stitch to the loop at the end. So I'll just show you again. I have my 10 stitches. I have my end loop that's in my right hand right now. I'm counting 10 bumps at the top. That does not count, but I am going to add a stitch in there, and then I'm going to go back to that 10th bump, and I'm going to stick my finger into that loop to make my first single crochet. So just using my index finger, I have the loop. I'm going to go into that 10th bump that I've started. Counting backwards, I pulled up a loop with my finger, then I stick my thumb into both and I grab the working yarn and pull it through. And I just made my first single crochet only using my hands instead of using the crochet hook. So now I'm just counting backwards and I still have 9 remaining bumps in my chain. So I'm going to go into that 9th loop, pull up the working yarn with my index finger. I have the remaining loop on my finger, so I have 2 loops. And I like to pull with my index finger and my thumb to make sure that my loop sizes are good and big. And you want to aim for around that 3 inches so your blanket, your chain, your whole thing doesn't get too tight. And you're going to continue all the way down the chain with your hand, making the single crochets. But I just wanted to show you from a dexterity point how to use your fingers as the crochet hook. So as you can see, I use my index finger quite a bit, and I use my index finger and my thumb to pinch the working yarn through the loops. Now that we're getting to the end of the row, I'm making my last, but this is my 10th single crochet across the chain. So my first row of single crochet stitches, I had that remaining loop. I'm adding a stitch. As you can see, the top kind of looks like a braid, and those are where you're going in every single row of your blanket, that top portion, but you're grabbing those 2 loops because you're grabbing from the single crochet of the first row. Now I'm going to flip my work around and I'm going to start my second row, but I had that remaining loop, I added a stitch. Now I'm going back into that 10th single crochet. I'm going to pull the working yarn up using both my index finger and my thumb. Made a whole row of single crochets. That last single crochet at the end of the row is always a little bit off to the side when you first start. I'm going to complete the last single crochet with my fingers. I'm going to have that remaining loop, and that remaining loop is part of the single crochet going into the next row. So we add a stitch on top of that remaining loop. Again, you want to make sure that your stitches are not too tight, so this way your whole blanket doesn't become too firm. So the last loop, we added the stitch. Now I'm going in to the single crochet that was made from the previous row, and there's 2 loops that you're going through to create the single crochet all the way across. So this is just a constant repetition as you increase. So again, you can use a crochet hook. That might be a really helpful tool to use as you're learning, but you can just use your fingers if you decide that you want to just do it without the crochet hook. So I chained for the actual blanket, I had chained 40 stitches. So once I chained about 40 stitches and did my first row of single crochets, my width of the blanket was 5 feet. Then I kept going with single crochet row after row, and the blanket came out in length of a full 5 feet. So this is where it was 5 feet by 5 feet square. The key takeaway with the blanket is understanding that when you end a row with a loop, you chain 1, flip it over. That's actually the first crochet of the next row. When you end a ball of yarn and you're starting a new one, I just tie a knot. That's all I do. You're going to want to pull it quite tight, but not too tight that you actually break it. And then once you've made it fairly tight, you're just going to take those 2 tails and you're going to cut them off. What it's going to do is it's going to create a little tiny bump, but the yarn itself is so thick you won't even see it in the pattern. Anytime I want to learn how to do a crochet pattern or learn something new regarding knitting or crocheting, I love to make a little sample size and just practice. So when I use those 10 stitches, no matter how big or small the project is, I can get a really good feel of how the pattern and the stitch works with the architecture. Using single crochet is the easiest way to start as a beginner, and you can make some beautiful projects. I just kept going row by row until I reached 5 feet. The total amount of balls of yarn I used was 10 for this blanket. To close your blanket, you're going to finish your last single crochet. Then all I do is I cut any remainder of the working yarn. I just cut that right off, and then I'm going to tie a knot by putting the working yarn right through that last loop. And then whatever remainder I have, I'll generally just weave it into the blanket back and forth, or you can cut a shorter tail and make 2 knots. Either way, it works beautifully, and then you're complete your single crochet chunky blanket. Thank you so much for joining me in this week's video. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to hit the subscribe button. I'm really looking forward to sharing more fun DIYs with you soon. Until then, take care.